Today I'm sharing with you the 5 top mistakes you want to avoid when applying Venetian plaster.
Hey, we're Blake and Melanie. We're on a journey to discover the things that fill life with joy, find more balance in the everyday, and even pursue some of our crazy ideas. We're sharing our story in the hopes that it'll encourage you to know yours and inspire you to go after your own big ideas. So we're inviting you along for it all.
Hey guys, if you're new here, I'm Blake and we have more Venetian plaster content for you guys today. Make sure to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and also make sure to check out our playlist that has more of our Venetian plaster videos. So today we're sharing with you our 5 top mistakes that we've made while applying Venetian plaster. These are things that are easily avoidable if you know what you're looking for. You're obviously gonna wanna avoid all 5 of these things, but the last one completely changed the way I apply Venetian plaster. So stick around. So our very first mistake is not priming your walls. Now, this is a step that obviously is boring. It's boring. To prime your wall is not very fun. You want to get right onto plastering. So our first tip is to make sure to prime your wall. The reason you want to prime your walls is if you're going over an old wall, obviously there's paint and there's pigment, and the primer blocks that pigment from coming through and soaking into your plaster. And if you're on a new wall, priming your wall helps the plaster adhere to the wall better. So the process I'd recommend for this is first priming your walls with a normal paint primer. I would suggest something like a Zinsser Bullseye 123, or there's that Kills that works really well. I'd first start with this. These are really good at blocking any pigments and any kind of weird seeping stuff that's in your walls. A lot of times if you have an older wall, things just kind of come through. There's already paint on the wall. It's good just to kind of go over with a primer to block all of that in. So after priming your walls with your paint primer, you're gonna wanna prime your walls with a Venetian plaster primer. Now this primer is called quartz primer, and it has a little bit of aggregate in it, which means that it's gonna be rough to the touch when you put it on. It's gonna allow the Venetian plaster to have something to grip onto as you're applying, as a smooth wall might not allow the Venetian plaster to really adhere to the wall. So you're really gonna wanna do both of these things. Now, if you have a brand new wall, you can definitely just jump straight to the quartz primer, not a big deal. If you have an old wall, definitely would suggest priming your wall with the paint primer first. The next mistake you wanna avoid is not taping off your walls or your trim. Now, this one is kind of annoying. Obviously, nobody likes to tape off walls. It's something that we forgot to do, obviously, as well. So it's definitely understandable, but it makes a big difference with how clean your lines are gonna look when you're done plastering. This is really, really important for plasters that have pigment in them. So something that is not just white. Obviously white, you can kind of get away with the fact that it's not perfectly clean. If you're just doing white walls, and you have a white ceiling, then that's gonna be okay. But I would still recommend taping it off just so you have those super clean lines, nothing's messy, the baseboards don't get plaster on them. Just tape everything off. It makes kind of a world of difference. I know it takes a little bit extra time, but it will pay off. And I'm saying this as someone who would rather not tape and just be super careful and just kind of edge in really nicely. Plaster is just a little different than paint, because on your trowel, your plaster is, has some thickness to it. So when you go into those corners, it's not always easy to keep that plaster off from the top of your trowel and hitting your ceiling or your baseboard. Sometimes the plaster drops on the baseboards. As much as you want to control the product, sometimes things happen. This is just going to prevent those things from getting on those baseboards and your ceiling and your trim. So I would just really recommend doing this. The next mistake to avoid is not mixing your plaster. Now, I am laughing because we've done this a few times where we didn't mix the plaster ourselves, and we've had pigment left in the bottom, we've had chunky plaster, we're trying to mix it up by hand. It's just not good. You paid a lot for this plaster. It's not very cheap, obviously, as you know, so mix it up. I have a little drill mixer here. This one just fits on a little handheld drill. There's bigger ones that are better if you have bigger buckets, but this is just kind of handy because it's not gonna be a big investment to get, and it does make a world of difference. When you get your plaster, if you buy it from a pre-mixed place, you're gonna still wanna mix it up even though it says it's pre-mixed. This is gonna help the consistency of the plaster be a little bit smoother. It's gonna allow any of the pigment that wasn't mixed in completely to get mixed in. And it's gonna make it super easy for you to apply because it'll be less thick, it'll be smooth, and it'll be ready to go. So the fourth one is more of an accident, and that is accidentally burnishing your first coat. It's something that's really easy to do when you're first starting out because you're trying to go over your first coat too many times. And what that does is that overworks your plaster and starts to burnish it before you really even have a second coat on. So this is really something to avoid if you're a perfectionist. When I started plastering, I wanted things to be perfectly smooth on the first coat. So I went over it a million times and thinking, oh, I'm just gonna smooth it out. But then I accidentally was compressing it and burnishing it. And you really don't wanna do that till the second coat. So this is something that you kinda gotta get used to. Just applying the plaster on and then letting it be, like getting it smooth and then moving away from it. So not going back into areas that you've already applied the plaster, especially as it starts to dry, you really just don't want to touch it. So the main key here is just to not overwork your first coat. If you have high points on your first coat and you want to get them off, knock it off with a knife before your second coat, and then you'll be good to go. And our last thing to avoid and final mistake is applying plaster from wet to dry. Now this is something that seems counterintuitive. Like when you first start applying plaster, you're gonna wanna work from wet to dry, and it just kind of makes sense. So I'm gonna kind of show you guys here, right? So if I'm right-handed, I actually wanna work from my left side to my right side. The reason I wanna do that is because I want to work back into the plaster I've done. So I always want to be working away from my plaster that I've already done. If you're left-handed, you're going to want to do that in opposite. You're going to work from right to left. So if you're left-handed, you're going to want to be working back into your plaster, right? So the tendency is to, if I'm right-handed, is to actually start on the right side. You want to avoid that mistake. So if I apply it here on my right side, and so it's wet here, and then I want to go over here, well, now I got to start in my wet stuff, and now I'm working out of my wet stuff. And the reason you don't want to do that is if you go into your wet stuff like this, you're going to leave a line. It's going to leave a mark. It's going to be messy. Now you're going to have to go back over it this way. So if you're working the right way, which is starting in the dry spot and working back to your wet spot, you're never leaving a mark in your wet spot. So if you work off the wall, kind of work off upside down like I've showed, and then work back into it, you're always gonna have those overlapping lines, but never have the mark of the trowel in your wet plaster. This kind of pairs with our last mistake of not overworking your plaster. If you work back into your wet plaster, then you're not going over your plaster as often for your first coat. So this is obviously a little counterintuitive at the beginning, but once you get used to it, this is something that's gonna change the way you plaster, and it's gonna make your outcome look a lot better and more uniform. So just as a recap, you want to apply your plaster from dry to wet. Always be working back into the plaster you just applied. Don't start in the plaster you applied. So there you have it. Those are our 5 mistakes that you want to avoid when applying Venetian plaster. Hopefully this is helpful for you guys. And if you want to see more of this content, make sure to subscribe.